Good morning. Welcome to B Cube Sunday morning, and it is a great Sunday morning. Uh, in a brief moment or two, I'm going to turn this show over to Cliff, and I'm going to fade into non-existence. And
Spooky.
oh yeah, spooky.
Before our fearless leader regales us with a patented political rant, I'm going to say good morning and happy Father's Day to all who celebrate. Happy Father's Day, Bob.
Thank you. Oops. Hey, something came up, and I got to get.
Okay.
All right.
Wow. That was Bob's fastest political rant ever. Good morning, everyone. I've got two wonderful returning guests here on my podcast, CL Cagney and Wendy Shaffer. CL, who I will be referring to periodically as Clare, because that's what the C stands for. For those who were wondering, Claire, are you what are your pronouns at this moment?
She, her.
Thank you. All right, and Wendy, I know you are she, her, right?
Mhm.
As you have been. And my pronouns today are dad, because I'm a dad. But hello, everyone. Hi, Cheryl. You're the first one to say hi in the chat. Today, for no particular reason, okay, because of yesterday, the topic is going to be empires and the rise and fall thereof. Both science fictional empires, like our favorite galactic empire, but also empires like Rome and other analogs that one might have for certain civilizations at this point. So here we are. C.L. Cagney is a writer, a wonderful writer whose stories have appeared in numerous publications and have been collected in. It's got the number 2 in it. What's it called?
Yes, Twice Born.
Twice Born.
Twice Born is the book.
Yes. I'm seeing the 2, which has a really cool cover, but I don't have it in front of me at the moment. And Wendy Shaffer, who has also written wonderful fiction, including my very favorite Mordred story, which I always bring up, and everyone should hunt that down. Where was that? That was published in a magazine.
Yeah, it was Paradox.
Paradox, issue 1, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, which is sadly long gone as a magazine.
No, it wasn't your fault. It did make it to issue 2.
It did. I think it made it a few more, but yeah.
Paradox, issue number 1. Look that up. Like, go to eBay or something. Go buy it and read her story. It's wonderful. Hopefully, that will be collected in some kind of collection someday. And she's written other stuff. She's also been the chair of the FogCon convention, which was a wonderful local writers convention. And C.L. Cagney is also like Bob, a ghost spooky, has ghost written numerous nonfiction works mostly, and done a great job of it apparently because she's continuing to do it. I don't know which works they are exactly because she's ghostly about them. But it is a time-honored profession among professional writers and a great way for people to hone their craft and complete projects by deadlines and good things like that and be all professional. So speaking of being all professional, we're going to get started. Again, happy Father's Day, and to all those fathers who witnessed the rise and fall of empires, which is what we're discussing. So my initial question for my panel of experts. Oh, and I should also point out that C.L. Cagney did a lot of work on this in school, right? You didn't quite have the minor, but you focused on
Yeah, I was a big fan of political science at the University of Michigan. There was this weird technicality where I didn't qualify for the major or the minor because of all the credits I needed for my neuroscience degree, but I got to study under Ronald Inglehart, which was a huge treat and has really informed how I view this kind of cross-cultural civilization evolution thing.
So yesterday we had a certain amount of civilization evolution. We had our first tin-plated dictator military parade under our current wannabe tin-plated dictator. Apparently, it was. Anyone ever see the video of like the squeaky tank? That was just sad. They're like just sparsely populated bleachers, nobody cheering, and this tank's rolling by and it's going squeak, 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 squeak. It's kind of adorable, but sad, very sad. Meanwhile, my wife and I went to one of the apparently over 2,000 protest events that were peaceful. Funny that. And I read a number that 11 million people turned up, but I don't know how accurate that is. I know that 2,000 protests is accurate, mostly in the U.S., but there were some elsewhere, like London. There was a sympathetic one, which is hilarious because, like, London literally, I mean, Britain has a king.
Yeah, but some of them feel a way about that.
Yeah, but I saw one hashtag was like "No kings in America" coming from Britain, which is I think very sweet.
Yeah.
I have had the song "No More Kings" from Schoolhouse Rock going through my head more or less on a continuous loop. A rockin' and a rollin', swishing and a splashing over the horizon. What do you see? Anyway, yeah. So there you go. So my first question. So that was that sort of inspired today's topic on the rise and fall of empires. So my first question is for my distinguished panel of experts: what is your favorite empire, fictional or real, that has risen and or fallen? Could be the American Empire. I mean, I'm kind of partial to the American Empire in the sense that I live here and kind of want it to be stable, but wish it were a little less imperial. maybe a little nicer, kinder, or as one of the previous presidents said, kinder and gentler while he went on to bomb various people. So yeah. Any thoughts on favorite empires that you would like to talk about, or just one you want to talk about?
So I'm gonna throw a maybe slightly oddball
excellent
choice in there, in that the Islamic caliphates are really interesting. I mean, I guess couple of empires, and also very. When I was in college, I took a class on Islam in the course of Western civilization, and that did a lot to shape my understanding of what empires are and how they function, and the upsides and downsides. And I think a lot of us do not appreciate how much of our history and culture was shaped by those empires.
Well, the Ottoman Empire certainly had a big part in the 20th century, early 20th century, which thus shaped the middle and late 20th century, mostly through bad decision making, unfortunately, but that's a thing. Claire, do you have a favorite empire?
I am bad at picking favorites of things in general, but I particularly like to study empires that are kind of long vanished, and as a result, people either completely forgot that they existed or built all these mysterious myths around. And I just find it really interesting because we get all these myths about what happened to this lost civilization, and I'm like, it's both usually very mundane and very much something we could learn from because it's the same stuff we're doing right now. So I am particularly intrigued by the Sumerians because they were kind of one of the first to do it, and had a remarkably similar set of problems in their late imperial stage to our current problems. I'm also a big fan of arguing about which empires count as the Roman Empire because of that whole Roman Empire meme. Like, do you count the early Latin kingdoms? Do the Ottomans count? Does the Holy Roman Empire count, even though it has no direct lineage? So I enjoy that historical conversation.
How much time per day do you in fact spend thinking about the Roman Empire? How many
I
times a day?
personally do not spend much, but I spend a lot thinking about the Sumerians and the Mayans.
All right, let's talk Sumerians and Mayans. Let's see. They were separated by many thousands of years from each other and many thousands of kilometers or miles. The Sumerians were, I want to say, the first large empire in the entire human history.
I believe so. I believe
And differed distinctly from the Akkadians that kind of came later. And we know much more about the Akkadians than we do, I think, about the Sumerians, although we have Gilgamesh. But, you know, and then there's the Babylonians, one of my favorite empires. I've been to the museum in Berlin that has like one of the gates of Babylon, which they moved brick for brick and then reassembled, and it's ginormous and very blue, and impressive even in the 21st century, and hard to imagine how impressive when attached to a wall, along with several other such gates. So yeah, empires like to build big. They're into big and central, and the Mayans built a lot of roads, if I'm remembering correctly. And then there were Aztec roads, and there were all these roads in the jungles of South America that we only found out about recently because the jungle had covered them up. But we were able to get like satellite imagery and whatever, and go, oh, hey, wait, whoa, civilization. Yeah, so desert sands cover things up, a la Ozymandias, and jungles cover things up as well. And if you believe in Atlantis, oceans cover things up.
I have a whole Atlantis rant, but the landmass I have identified as Atlantis was not an empire, so not pertinent to this discussion.
Okay, that's fair enough. And we could also, like, you know, we could go into things that aren't empires, like Plato's Republic, which is probably a lot more empire-like than most democracies, right? For example, because it does have these archons running the show, and they try and keep them honest by, like, you know, not paying them and stuff. But it doesn't. I think Plato's Republic would corrupt into Plato's Empire in about 5 minutes flat, pretty much. You know, or after at least one long weekend where the archons had a bender, and then they wake up and they're like, let's just run things. You know. Anyway, so let's talk about the other thing that has been on people's mind lately is the Star Wars Empire, because of season 2 of Andor, which showed us a few weeks ago outrageous things like a senator being dragged away by guards and taking off camera, which of course never happens in real life, except apparently to California senators in Los Angeles. And there's even been like footage, like the memes where they put the top, like, here's the Star Wars and here's Senator Padilla, and so we've got the Gorman senator and we've got the real life California senator, and it's like creepily too much like real life. So but in Star Wars, it took them like 20 years to get to that, the Empire to get to that point, and in real life, it took them 6 months for the current administration to get to that point. So, yeah. And someone, Cheryl points out, there were major trade routes all through the Americas pre-European colonization. That is correct. Yes, absolutely. Because one thing people do is they create silk roads and other things like that. There's a great bit in Life of Brian about the Roman Empire. What have the Romans ever done with us? Well, they built roads and
Yes.
aqueducts, and well, other than that, what have they ever done? You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about. I think we should talk about how empires rise, build power, and then how that breaks down. And they try and harder to grasp at more and more straws, and it's just not working. So let's start about the rise of empires. How did the Mayan and Sumerian empires begin?
The the Sumerian Empire is really interesting because it seems like what happened at some point is that in the Fertile Crescent, there were all of these city states, right? And that was the basic unit of governance. It was you could build walls around your city to defend them, similar deal to in ancient Greece, where you centralized your infrastructure and your military and your urban people, and then you had farmland around the walled city. And it seems like at some point it occurred to one of these Sumerian rulers, I believe Sargon usually gets the credit for this, that, hey, we probably have enough soldiers to conquer that other guy's city state. And that was something that hadn't really been done successfully before. So he started to accrue other city states that were subordinate to his empire, and that's kind of the definition, excuse me, of an empire, right? It's a political unit that rules a lot of political units outside of itself, or within itself, I guess, but just beyond a single nation or state. And yeah, it's interesting because I see a lot of people valorizing Sargon for that, and there's this whole interesting debate in academia because on one hand, it's a very aggressive thing to do, obviously, to go, hey, you know what? I'm pretty sure we have enough military that we could conquer our neighbor over there. On the other hand, one thing that empires do tend to do is prevent fighting between local city states, because if you're all part of the same empire, you don't go to war with each other. So there's the Pax Romana and similar patterns have been seen in other empires where violence overall actually decreases because random people aren't, looting each other and having skirmishes and all of that. So it's an interesting question, this kind of valorization of the empire builders. um, Wendy, I bet you know a lot about the rise of empires.
Um, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, definitely the pattern that you tend to see is military conquest, and you make a really good point that one of the things that is an advantage of an empire is you get uh, a certain degree of peace, um, and uh, you know, easy travel and trade connections and all of these things that tends to be bought at the expense of, first, a lot of people dying in the initial conquest, and second, often a degree of exploitation and removal of self-determination from the conquered peoples. um, and um, but yes, I mean the American empire is maybe an interesting. There certainly was military conquest involved in that, but I think I would argue that was in many cases driven by and supplemented by economic
Yeah.
domination.
Well,
There's
certainly
this.
the conquest of the territory that is the 48 contiguous states was military.
Yes.
um, and then kind of in an overwhelming way. Also, I would say largely unintentional, but sometimes actually creepily intentional biological warfare. And then once World War II happened and Europe had finished its 50-year self-destruction at the beginning of the 20th century, thus, ending the European empires. There was a power gap that America and the Soviet Union went into, which we are all old enough to remember. And so it was two empires, right? There was the good empire and the evil empire, per Ronald Reagan. I'm not sure he was quite correct about that, but whatever. And then, of course, the Soviet Union self-destructed because more or less ran out of money. It was running on fumes for the last 10 years or 20 years of that. And so now we have this sort of one empire, but it doesn't. I think America, one thing we haven't talked about with empires is national myths that construct them, right? Like Rome had Romulus and Remus and hired Virgil to create its Homeric epic, right? America has the myth of the frontier, right? That is, which is capitalism, right? Expand or die. And so when we finished with the frontier, then the myth had to switch to something else, and that something else was the enemy. We are here in opposition to the enemy. And in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union broke apart, and we were buddies with China because only Nixon could go to China. That's an old Vulcan saying. All of a sudden we didn't have an enemy. And that lasted until Al-Qaeda came in 2001. But it kind of started to eat itself in that situation. I don't know. What do my distinguished panel of experts say about that?
Well, I did want to throw in an interesting thing about Virgil and the Aeneid, because something I've always found fascinating is there's a moment in the Aeneid where Aeneas comes out of the underworld, and there are two gates, one of horn and one of ivory, and the gate of horn is the gate for truth, and the gate of ivory is the gate for delusion. And Aeneas comes out of the gate of ivory, the gate for delusion. And it turns out there is a whole academic debate about, was that Virgil actually critiquing the Roman project in a very subtle way, or did he just screw up and make a typo, or various things. And I've always been insanely curious about that. I asked my professor when I was studying the Aeneid in college, and he was like, I'll tell you what, switch your major to comparative literature and we'll do your thesis on it. And I didn't take him up on that. But I got a degree in chemistry instead. Can't say I regret it, but
served you well. Yes.
Yes. But I guess that's a reminder that even our myths can contain complications.
Certainly.
Yeah, I don't know if this is on the topic of founding myths, but on the topic of kind of late stage empire myths. I see Liam is saying in the chat that there were probably Roman equivalents of MAGA. There were. And it's one of the reasons that I study these old empires is that I'm really interested in their religions. And you can find commentaries that I like to call the Roman equivalent of Fox News, where there are these commentators being like, all these foreigners and effeminate men are ruining Roman masculinity, and we need to go, kick them out and conquer them, and all of these things. And it's just remarkable how similar the rhetoric is to today. They even did the whole scapegoating LGBTQ people, where there were these priests, priestesses. It's interesting to think about how they might have identified today, but they were religious clergy who became eunuchs and presented as women in the service of goddesses. And the Roman Fox News really couldn't stand them and were convinced that they were, destroying the Roman Empire. And it's just so interesting to see how specifically these patterns repeat. And of course, my opinion would be that the real thing that was destroying the Roman Empire was their unsustainable military spending and wealth inequality, but that's a whole other thing.
Funny how the one distracts from the other. So there were the Gallic Wars, and then there were the Culture Wars, and then there wasn't any Roman Empire anymore. Next thing you know, there's a horse for a senator. Anyway, so would you say that like Caligula was a cause or a symptom? I mean, it was pretty bad, but
Well, my favorite thing about Caligula that I must share that has no relevance to geopolitics, but apparently the name Caligula is like a diminutive form of the term for like Roman army boots.
yeah, little bit.
So I heard a British commentary say that his name would literally translate to something like little boots or bootykins, because he was the son of a general, and so they would put these little tiny military boots on him, and everyone thought it was very adorable, and it just stuck. So Emperor Bootykins, I think was probably a symptom, in my humble opinion. We see this thing, and unfortunately, I think we're kind of seeing it in real time with Elon Musk right now, where having a lot of wealth and power kind of breaks people's brains, it seems, and even people who, earlier in their lives were very rational and arguably good decision makers get really strange ideas. And I don't know if it's because there's no one to say no to them, but they just go off the rails. For those who were at some point fans of Musk, it's interesting to see how much he is contradicting his own ideas from 10 or 20 years ago right now. And it's interesting to speculate how just having basically unlimited wealth has done something to his judgment circuits. And I think that explains a lot of the more unusual behavior of a lot of the Roman emperors, which also another thing that I want to remind the audience of is that the Roman Empire came after the Roman Republic. There was a Roman Republic that became an empire after Rome decided to give Julius Caesar basically dictator power to
well, after
solve
Caesar
some
crossed the
national problems.
Rubicon, right? Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
there was this rule, right? The generals couldn't do that. And bring Roman troops onto Roman soil to
Yeah.
deal with Romans. Sounds familiar. And he did that. Yeah. Specifically to prevent empire.
And for a
And
hot
they gave him
second, it's yeah.
yeah, and then like Cassius and all those guys stopped it, right? But only very briefly. Because
Yeah.
it was bigger than Caesar. Clearly, right? It was like we like to think of, well, Caesar started the Roman Empire. Yeah, but he was immediately murdered on the Senate floor, and the empire was over, and we were back to a republic. But yet the empire came roaring back, right? And Augustus and Tiberius were more powerful than Caesar probably could have become, even had he stayed in power, right? Because there was this sort of path that, so you can look at it and you can go great man theory of history, or you can go historical forces, humans are not important, and either one you could get you could get a thesis right out of either one.
And I mean, this may go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's important for us to remember right now, because I think the kind of myth of progress that a lot of us were taught growing up is that less enlightened forms of government evolve into more enlightened forms of government. But in Rome, the Republic became an empire, which then led to all kinds of insane behavior because there were no checks and balances. And just gonna throw that out there today.
Funny
Sorry,
that.
Wendy, you were saying?
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, this may play into CL, your favorite subject of what exactly counts as the Roman Empire, because the Roman Republic was certainly very imperial in its pattern of military conquest. The territorial expansion of Rome. I mean, that was why Caesar had an army to take back across the Rubicon. So it is interesting to see sort of the two different aspects of an empire, in that you have the expansion by conquest and a lot of the things that come with that, and then you have the change in the political system to a much more autocratic form of government.
Yeah. So the arc of history bends towards the rise and fall of empires, is what you're saying, or the moral arc of history, right? Yeah, and I mean, it's here we are, right? Watching an American administration become overtly fascist, and that is living memory. Like today is Father's Day, right? And my dad is 91 and remembers Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin. And it's living memory that this went really, really badly for Hitler, Mussolini, and not so much Stalin, but certainly they're not too much longer after Stalin, right? Like a few decades. All this, the last time that and then Kaiser Wilhelm, who was just absolutely nuts to create an empire. And people remember that Hitler called his empire the Third Reich. Well, the Second Reich was Kaiser Wilhelm, and the First Reich was Charlemagne, right? In his reckoning, the Holy Roman Empire. So he was trying to see his Nazi Germany as an extension of Rome, right? Because it's an extension of Karl Magna, right? Charlemagne in German. And Karl Magna was, of course, seeing himself through the papacy as an extension of Rome. And so there's this attempt to, I mean, it's really interesting because empires they attempt to connect to previous empires and ignore the fact that those empires collapsed, and that's why they're previous. And meanwhile, here in America, we're like, there are people who are very much like yesterday. People are very much aware. There's people with signs saying, depicting Trump as Hitler with, circles and lines through it and things like that, or putting Hitler mustaches on him. Like, we know, right? Like, this doesn't go well. This is a bad idea. This has terrible consequences. Millions of people die. It doesn't work. Yet there seems to be a large percentage of people who have the memory of Dory from Finding Nemo. Anyone want to? The thing about empires, not like when when Sumerians started their empire, when Sargon said, "Hey, let's attack that other city-state," he didn't have any negative examples from history to pull on about how this would go a few hundred years down the road. And so now we do. We have like every single empire that has ever existed has fallen, right? What's the oldest empire in the world right now? Like real empire, like not like, you know, the kingdom of such and such in Europe or whatever, like Liechtenstein. The Liechtenstein empire will never fall. No, I mean, you know, that would probably be the United States at this point, right? You know, we're older than communist China. We're certainly older than the Soviet Union and current Putin Russia, which is Soviet Union Part 2 or 2.0. And you know, we are not learning from that. Maybe we should not rush the transition state from republic to empire, because the longer you can make it as a republic, the better off you are, generally speaking, you know.
It really does bother me how it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that having wealth and power just completely breaks your judgment. Because what we see over and over again in this history of empires is that the more powerful the leaders become, the worse their judgment gets, until we get to where I would argue we are today, where at least some of the leaders are like, well, this thing is gonna, meet my demands now, so we're gonna do it. And the fact that it is obviously mathematically not sustainable, we're just not gonna worry about, and we're gonna run misinformation campaigns about. You see that in Sumer. You see the emperors going, okay, we need these farmers to produce more grain so we can feed more military, and the farmers and what might pass for the equivalent of Sumerian scientists going, that's not a good idea. The fields are going to get fallow, and then you're not going to be able to produce any grain. And the emperor is going, we don't care, make it happen. And one of the things I don't think enough people know about the communist empires is that they're famous for causing a lot of starvation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was done mostly through bad administrative decision making. And one of the specific things that happened was that a lot of geneticists were banned from the Soviet Union because there were these quacks who were telling the Soviet leaders, hey, we figured out this way we can make grain grow in these soils and climate conditions that have never been able to grow grain before. And the geneticists were like, that is not how that works. You can't just like treat seeds with cold and they'll magically immediately develop the ability to tolerate cold. And the imperial leaders were like, we're going to listen to the people who are telling us we want to hear, not the people who know what they're talking about. And then loads of crops failed. So there's some very common patterns that bother me.
It sounds a lot like climate science and epidemiology. And yeah, let's just wipe out what doesn't support the official narrative. And, you know, and it's like a power grab and a money grab by the top 0.1%, right? So that
it's not even
also
rationally self-interested.
No, because, and when you're someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, money is like, you know, who cares if you have 100 billion or 200 billion or 300 billion or 1 billion, right? You're never going to be able to spend it all. And you have enough money to, you know, buy whatever levers of power you can buy, which has its limits, as Elon Musk discovered recently in his spat with Donald Trump, that, yeah, you have money, but he has power, you know, and money is not 100% a proxy for power. And so, you know, there's this pathology where they just want more, right? Like Musk wants to be they all want to be the first trillionaire in history, as if that's an accomplishment, right? So they're working for that. That's what they could be enjoying life, right? They're still mortal, right? You know, and so they could spend their time trying to be the world's first trillionaire, or they could be like, Andrew Carnegie and be remembered not for, rapacious capitalism, but for goodwill, good deeds in later life. Which do they want to be remembered for? The first trillionaire, or the guy to send people to Mars, or Andrew Carnegie? None of them pick Andrew Carnegie, right? And that's significant. It's interesting about, I wonder, because the Elon Musk of today is in serious cognitive decline compared to the Elon Musk of 10 years ago, but he's also done a ton of drugs, right? Like really like epic levels of ketamine. And I mean, just, and mixed with whatever, right? I'm kind of surprised he's still standing. I mean, I'm sure he's got personal physicians and whatnot, but he's like, like at least Zuckerberg works out, right? Musk is just ravaging his body and brain, and that's very clear. And so I wonder how many of those like Roman empires were like drunk all the time or stoned or whatever, because they were making very poor decisions, and it could just be power. I mean, that's part of it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but also, and in the in the worst possible way, but also, how much cognitive impairment were they putting on themselves, and then why? Right? You got to ask why. You're the world's richest human being. Why? What are you trying to numb?
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that's interesting to me about Musk is that he has this real glorification of productivity, right? To the point where he brags about how little he sleeps because he's always working. And I'm like, you are probably using stimulants that are destroying your brain, because I have a neuroscience degree and your brain needs sleep to not break down. It needs quite a lot of sleep, actually. So there's this interesting connection, but in my mind, between his valorization of, doing infinite work and probably his cognitive decline.
Yeah. I think there's a very almost gamification attitude there where the goal is to make the number go up, whether it's, his net worth, the number of kids he has, just it's all about making the score go up. And I don't want to diagnose anybody, but
here on the show, we diagnose your celebrity psychological problems.
But I think we certainly have a strain in modern global capitalistic culture that says that your value lies in what you produce, and that productivity wins over everything else. And I think if you believe that on a sufficiently deep level, it is really, really easy to drive yourself into incredibly self-destructive behavior while chasing that goal.
Well, let's talk about bringing it back to empires. Let's talk about the last 200-300 years, right? So the Industrial Revolution started in Europe, which is going to create a European hegemony that lasts until World War I, when it's self-destructed, right? And then World War II, when the final nails on the coffin of self-destruction, where what is it? World War I was literally three of Queen Victoria's grandsons fighting each other, and like, yeah, that's a little family spat that killed millions of people. Anyway, so Europe remade productivity, right? They took the, starting in Manchester, England, according to my textbooks, but basically Europe, they took the agrarian basis for empire, the feudal agrarian basis for empire, which wasn't going to scale to the global market, right, global situation, and made, machined capitalism out of it. And look, if you can make like a factory that puts out a bunch of automobiles, right, you can make a factory that puts out a bunch of tanks. Funny how that works. And so, like the first use of any new technology that humans invent is usually pornography, but then the second use is like weapons. Um, and currently we have weaponized internet, right? Like the first wave was porn, and as the Avenue Q song goes, the internet is for porn. Yeah. But now it's for memes and mind share and
disinformation,
politics, right? The infant, and I mean, more, it's bigger, right? It's the second wave of the technology. And so, that is, I mean, where is this gonna? Are we gonna see at some point? Do you think a single global empire of humanity, like as predicted by Asimov and other science fiction writers, even an interplanetary empire or a republic that turns into an empire? I mean, does it just get bigger and bigger until we run out of Earth, and then and then what happens when that empire collapses? Science fiction writers.
Yeah, that kind of depends on how badly we manage to screw ourselves over, because that, to be honest, one of the reasons I don't have any like recent in the last few years science fiction works is because I had been operating on the assumption that that was going to happen, and then I kept looking at the decisions that people are making today and being like, I'm not sure we're gonna have the resources to do that if we keep, I love what Wendy said about productivity, because I feel like that really typifies what destroys empires. The Sumerians are like, oh, produce all the grain now. Don't listen to these people who tell you that's going to mean you can't produce grain in the future. And that's kind of where we are as a global society right now, where we're like, oh, produce more stuff now. And all these people are being like, so climate change. And that's going to be a problem. So I'm not sure how I feel about whether we're going to get off Earth successfully. I am far less sure about that now than I was 5 or 10 years ago. Wendy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, I feel like right now it's just gotten very hard to predict the future, because it's, it used to be like, you could think about what might be happening in 5 or 10 years, and now it's like, I'm not sure what's going to be happening in 3 months.
The future ain't what it used to be.
The future definitely ain't what it used to be. I do think there's another element to the both the relentless drive to productivity, and something Karen Anderson said in the chat was, I associate empire with bad management. There is also this thing that you see in a lot of empires where the wealthy and powerful manage to get themselves exempted from the obligations of civic participation, like paying their taxes and engaging in military service, and the other things that have been keeping the administrative state of the empire running. And looking at what's going on with tax cuts and bills exempting the AI industry from regulation, and all of these other things, I am definitely seeing a move towards the powerful exempting themselves from their obligations. I mean, I think in the long term, the thing that we see is that empires rise, empires fall, and then empires rise again. So on a sufficiently long time scale, assuming we survive as a species, maybe we do achieve a global empire, or maybe we evolve beyond the idea of empire.
So let's talk about that. One thing that we as a species, there's two things that are sort of counter trends. On the one hand, we seem to keep allowing people who are narcissistic sociopaths who don't care about the future to run things, right? Because I think the reasonable people just let them in some kind of social dynamic way. And so that's the one hand, which causes the rise and fall of empires, maybe partly. But the other thing is, as I alluded to earlier, unlike Sargon of Sumer, we have history, right? We know how this goes. We can apply the lessons and plenty of people are doing it, right? Like I said yesterday, lots of comparison to Hitler and the Nazis in the signage and the verbiage. And it's not like we don't see it coming, right? And so how is it that humanity can get to a point where, yeah, we see it coming, but then we stop it, right? That seems to be like every empire, it's like that cartoon of the two people sitting in the study, and one of them says, yeah, but the problem, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And it's the doom of everyone who does know history to watch it happen and be unable to stop it, right? And so why are we as a species unable to prevent this, right? What is wrong with us? Octavia Butler, in her Xenogenesis, or later Lilith's Brood, because I guess marketing people got a hold of it and didn't like Xenogenesis. Anyway, her Xenogenesis trilogy, starting with Dawn, the aliens who show up critique humanity. And their critique of humanity was, a problem with your species is that you're, one, intelligent, and two, hierarchical. And that leads to all your problems, right? So I would say that is correct. Although I'll also sort of qualify that and say we're hierarchical to a point. We're tribal, right? We're at an evolutionary level, right? Like we form into empires, but empires are these heterogeneous collections of competing tribal interests, which also have a problem, right? Like you saw in Syria, Assad came from a particular ethnic group within Syria and elevated his ethnic group during his reign to be all powerful. And now the current Islamist government that has taken over is persecuting that very same ethnic group, I think out of revenge, right? And also out of tribalism, because it's not their ethnic group, right? And so, people tend to use, people outside of, say, the Middle East, tend to look at the Middle East through a colonialist lens of understanding, which is there are nation states. It's a very 19th century view. But like a state like Syria is composed of things that don't look like a nation state, right? Which is why there's problems, and why there's groups like the Druze in southern Syria that can be persecuted, and the various other, the Yazidi, and anyway, there's a whole lot of tribes. So humans are very tribal, and there's a song by Peter Gabriel, "Not One of Us," right? You may look like we do, you may talk like we do, but you know how it goes. You're not one of us, right? So yes, that does not bode well for the current U.S., Karen. I agree. And so, okay, Karen asks about the rise of rival powers and are empires destroyed by external forces. Well, yes and no. It's a combo, right? Like in Rome, they evolved to hiring more non-Roman mercenaries as legionnaires, right? Which meant you had Roman trained military of different tribes who weren't tribally Roman in the sense I'm using the term tribal, right? They weren't Romans, they were like Gallic mercenaries or whatever. And that opens up to an external threat from within, right? You know, and like the US is using more mercenary soldiers, right? Especially for like special ops kind of things. So they're using like that was a big deal in Iraq, right? Was these kind of out of control mercenary forces. And Putin had a big issue with a mercenary unit, right? That got mad at him and marched to Moscow and almost defeated him, right? He was able to somehow hold on to power and eliminate the leader of the Mercs, and then absorb them into the Russian army. But remember when that happened? When suddenly there was this weekend of holy crap! There's this, you know, his mercenary, the Wagner unit, right? Was marching toward Moscow. Like, oh dear, your empire seems to be in a little bit of trouble right now, right? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to consider this internal versus external threat question, because the narrative that we're taught in history classes is that, you know, this empire fell because this other empire conquered it. But the question in my mind is, why was that empire able to be conquered? You know, is it that a bigger, badder empire came along, or is it that the old empire stopped working for internal reasons and then someone else stepped into the power vacuum? Because one of the things that you see in common between the late Roman Empire and today, and this is something that I'm fascinated that no one's talking about. So I saw the picture of the military parade and this big pavilion that says "Go Army" on top of it. And there's this picture that's been circulating of this pavilion, and like no one is there.
But it's also
And
very fascist architecture. I would say that strikingly fascist pavilion architecture.
It's very fascist, and it's also very sad, like you were saying about the squeaky tank.
Yeah, the
And
squeaky
something
tank
that I'm
video.
fascinated that no one is talking about is that the US military's recruitment has been dropping, and they've been missing their recruitment quotas by a lot.
They have.
And in my opinion, the reason that's happening, and the thing that we see with a lot of empires, is that power and wealth become so concentrated at the top that two things happen. And one is that I see how many people today are aware that we're repeating history. And I'm really curious now if this was the case with other empires. It seems like everyone is aware that we're repeating history except the people with the decision making power. And they think they're special. And the thing that comes with that is that the reward for kind of participating in the empire for ordinary people drops so low that people just stop doing it. So your military recruitment drops and your military power drops. And one of the other things that you see is that when we talk about, you know, fallen empires, I think there's this old idea that everyone just died or something. But in many cases, we're finding what actually happened is that everyone went, this isn't worth it, and went off and started a farm. You know, the Maya didn't disappear. They're still living in that area. They just walked away from the empire because the reward for participating in it wasn't sufficient to motivate anymore. So anyway, that's
Andrew Roberts.
my little rant.
That's great. That's great. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just saw a great comment from Andrew that empires fall when they consume more than they produce. And I would say it's also like who consumes it, right? And who produces it. I think that, you know, army recruitment is going to continue to go down as long as the president wants to use the armed forces against the American people and also cut veterans benefits, right? Like those are two big disincentives, right? And if you're attacking higher ed, well, Army and, you know, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of the National Guard will help you get higher ed education, it'll pay your college tuition and whatever. But if the administration is attacking the very concept of college, that's not an incentive, right? And so, you know, they just want slaves to do whatever they want without having the slaves to have any incentive, right? So they want, you know, and they don't want people to vote, and they don't. Anyway, they really want a master slave culture,
And then
which
they
doesn't
want
work for most
PI.
people. Yeah, funny how that works, but people don't like that for some reason. Bob, you have returned from the ether.
Yes, I have.
So, momentarily, let's say, did any last words from my panel of experts before we let Bob have the last word, last word, the final last word? Anything? That was a good bit about the Roman Empire there, Claire. Do you want to add to that, or?
The only thing I'm going to say is you're talking about this master slave culture where what they ultimately want is workers who require no compensation to do whatever they want. That's what AI is.
Mm, yep, and it doesn't work. Funny that, just like the cold grain doesn't work. Wendy, do you have any other final comments?
I just wanted to throw in a plug. Speaking of our favorite fictional evil empire from Star Wars, one of my favorite podcasts, a podcast called Conspirituality, which is all about the connections between conspiracy theories, spiritual woo-woo, and right-wing extremism.
Ooh,
It's a really fascinating podcast. And
kind
I
of depressing though.
yeah, I mean it's not feel good listening, but one of the ones that is kind of feel good listening is one of the hosts has been doing a short series on watching Andor with his kids, and how that
Which I did.
how he uses that to address the current political situation with his kids. And I highly recommend that for anybody who is interested in these topics, which I imagine includes most people here.
I've been living that dream. Well, the older kids, right?
Yeah.
But my teenagers, yes.
Mhm.
All righty. Thank you so much for being on and discussing Empire. And my last word is actually not about Empire, but about Father's Day, which is fathering and parenting is the job. Like anyone who does the job is a parent, and whether you're biologically connected or not, I feel very strongly about this particular issue. All right, Bob, take it away.
Well, thank you all for coming. I very much appreciate some of y'all's insights, and the reminder that next week we have a very special guest coming in, Mark Tufo. Uh, for those of you who don't know Mark Tufo, bummer.
But you have a chance to virtually meet Mark Tufo next week.
Yeah, the I can still remember the best Mark Tufo line. We had him on a podcast here with David Gerald, and Mark, who is a very successful writer these days, was talking about his early efforts to get published and make it go. And he is the guy that I will say should give hope to every person laboring away and packing books in their garage to try and make a break. Um, and he was talking about all of his rejection slips that he worked through. And David Gerald looks over at him and said, "What is this rejection slip?" And I don't think I've ever seen Mark get speechless before, but it was a moment where it was possibly one of the best delivered lines I've ever seen. So it will be Mark Tufo next week, and I tell you, for a and if you want to be entertained, follow him on Facebook. He is it's TUFO, and I hesitate to say this because I feel like it so diminishes, but he writes zombie, but he writes zombie good. He writes a kind of zombie that even if you don't like zombie, you can read and enjoy. I saw his first book and I just bought it on a whim. That said, something different, and the reviews don't suck. 25 books later, I've read that and his other series. And one of my best memories on Mark Tufo is coming back from Texas. I'd gone to or Oklahoma. I'd gone to a convention down there with my granddaughter, and we're coming back, and she had listened to one of the books partially while she was down there. And so there we are with my headphones. She's got one earpiece and I've got the other, and we're leaning together listening to the audio book on one of Mark's books. So it's he's a brilliant writer, and he's a wonderful personality. And that said, I'm just going to say it: resist, because that's the only option we have. Watching the Trump put out an announcement yesterday or today after all the protests. He basically listened to his billionaire buddies and the people, and he told ICE to back off on raiding workplaces because immigration does need to be managed. You can't let you talk about empires falling. Empires fell when you lost control of your borders, but at the same point, you cannot say to the people that come in and help build your homes, your factories, and work and fill them. You can't say to them, "Oh, thank you for doing that. Now get the hell out." Uh, they earned a spot in this country, and we need to respect that. So that said, oh, and one other minor point I will leave with you on the fall of empires, and I'll let you guys have this to think about. Empires. You talked about the empires falling when the rich and the powerful no longer have a stake in the common man's issues with an empire. That is what I would call a symptom of an empire heading for collapse. Another great symptom is when the power in the empire turns to the church or the equivalent thereof. Uh, Genghis Khan's one of the greatest times in his empire, and this goes beyond his initial into his legacy, is very open religion. He brought in everybody. He didn't have a state religion. He didn't care. But his descendants, when the state grew weak, turned to religion to shore it up. And when you become dependent on the religion, you're no longer a government of the people, by the people, for the people, or even a benevolent dictatorship. You are a theocracy, and a theocracy is never, ever good. So that said, um, let's watch out for those symptoms of collapse. Oh, wait. We've got our rich, we've got our upper classes disassociated with the struggles of the working man, disassociated from the interests of the country, and we've turned to religion to salvage the government. We're fucked. Okay, but we can get it back. Protest, and later. Thank you guys.